Four powerful bikers lay beaten, robbed, and chained to trees deep in a Georgia forest, the afternoon sun beating down without mercy. Truck after truck slowed, glanced, then sped away. Hope was nearly gone when Yancey Brooks, a black single father rushing to pick up his 6-year-old daughter, heard a faint cry for help. He had no phone, no weapon, nothing but a half-empty water bottle. Still, he stepped into the trees and said 4 words that would change everything. "Don't be scared, I'll help." 2 weeks later, 2,000 riders showed up looking for him. Why? If stories like this one are the kind that stay with you, hit subscribe before we go any further. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you more stories worth sitting with. Yancey Brooks had learned to move through mornings like a man diffusing something fragile. Before the sun came up over Winslow Springs, Georgia, he was already awake, sitting on the edge of Maya's bed with a small glucose meter in his hand, waiting for a number that would tell him whether the day ahead was going to be an easy one or a hard one. Most mornings the number came back fine, and he would let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, then move on to making breakfast, braiding what he could of her hair, and getting her dressed for school. He worked at Ray Dalton's garage on the edge of town, the kind of place with one bay, a hand-painted sign, and more trust than money changing hands. In the evenings he took whatever else came his way, fixing a neighbor's lawnmower, cutting grass for the elderly folks on Route 9, patching a leaking roof for cash that went straight into an envelope marked rent. None of it was glamorous, and none of it was enough, but it kept the lights on and it kept Maya in the only home she had ever known. 3 years earlier, his wife had died after a sudden illness that the doctors never fully explained to him, and since then, it had been just the two of them. Maya had been 3 years old when her mother passed, and by the time she turned 6, she had already learned to watch her father's face the way other children watched cartoons, searching it for signs of whether things were okay. She did not remember her mother's voice anymore, only a feeling, and Yancey had promised himself a long time ago that she would never have to search his face wondering if he was coming back too. There had been a version of his life once that looked entirely different. In high school, Yancey had been the kind of student who could look at a broken engine or a sagging bridge and see, almost instantly, the shape of what needed to change to fix it. A letter from Georgia Tech had arrived the spring before his high school graduation, offering him a place in their engineering program, and for a few months he had let himself imagine a life built out of steel beams and circuit diagrams instead of grease and desperation. That letter still hung on the wall of his bedroom, yellowed at the edges now, never framed, never thrown away either. Some nights after Maya had fallen asleep with her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, Yancey would take out an old spiral notebook and sketch things nobody had asked him to design. Bridges, small emergency shelters, devices that might help people survive on roads exactly like the ones that ran through his own county, roads where a car could break down and nobody would know for hours. Maya had caught him at it more than once, padding into the room in her socks and pointing at the drawings with the unashamed curiosity only a 6-year-old has. She would ask him if he was going to build these things one day, and he would always answer the same way, telling her that they would build them together when they finally had enough time. It was a soft lie, the kind fathers tell so their children can keep believing in something, and he told it to himself just as often as he told it to her. On the Thursday, everything changed. Yancey left the garage later than he meant to. Ray had needed help finishing a transmission job, and by the time Yancey wiped the last of the grease from his hands, the sun was already dropping toward the tree line. He had promised Maya's neighbor he would pick her up before dark, and he had never once been late for that promise. Not since her mother died, not since Maya started flinching every time he walked out the door. To save time, he cut down County Road 12, a stretch of cracked asphalt that ran through nothing but pine forest for almost 7 miles. There were no houses out there, no gas stations, and famously no cell signal, which was exactly why most people avoided it after dark. Yancey knew the road well enough to trust it, and today trusting it meant getting home 20 minutes faster than the highway would allow. He was maybe 2 miles in when he first heard it, a sound thin and broken beneath the hum of his own engine, easy to mistake for a bird or an animal caught somewhere in the underbrush. He slowed without fully deciding to, some old instinct pulling his foot off the gas before his mind caught up with what his ears were telling him. When the sound came again, longer this time, unmistakably, A human voice. He pulled over onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The forest went quiet except for that voice, and a strange still attractive of the road that made the hair on his arms rise. He noticed the tire tracks first. Deep gouges cut into the soft red clay of the shoulder, the kind of marks that come from vehicles stopping hard and fast rather than pulling over politely. A truck rolled past behind him as he stood there, slowing just enough for the driver to get a look at the scene, then speeding up again as if it had seen nothing worth stopping for. A sedan did the same thing minutes later, brake lights flashing briefly before the car vanished around the bend. Yancey stood on the shoulder for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, torn between the voice calling from the trees and the clock ticking in his head that counted down toward Maya's pickup time. But the voice came a third time, weaker now, edged with something closer to panic than a wounded animal could ever produce, and something in him simply would not let him get back in the car and drive away. He pushed through a wall of underbrush and pine branches, following the sound deeper than he expected to go, until the trees opened into a small clearing where 4 motorcycles sat abandoned, their chrome catching what little light made it through the canopy. There were no riders in sight at first, only the bikes and an unsettling quiet, until his eyes adjusted, and he saw them, 4 men, chained by their wrists to 2 thick pine trunks, their gear stripped and scattered across the dirt. One man had a gash along his hairline that had bled down the side of his face and dried into his beard. Another sat with his hands swollen and discolored, the chain cutting so deep into his wrist that his fingers had gone a dull shade of purple. A third barely lifted his head when Yancey approached, his voice hoarse from what must have been hours of shouting into an empty forest. The 4th man, older than the others, kept his composure even in obvious pain, his eyes tracking Yancey with a sharpness that suggested he was already calculating whether this stranger was help or another kind of danger. That 4th man spoke first, his voice low and steady despite everything, warning Yancey that whoever had done this still had guns and could come back through the trees at any moment. It was not a plea for help so much as a warning wrapped around one, as if even chained to a tree and bleeding. This man's first instinct was to protect a stranger from walking into the same trap he had. Yancey looked at his watch without meaning to, the numbers glowing faintly in the dimming light of the forest. Maya would be standing by the door soon, watching for his truck the way she always did, counting the minutes, the way children count things they are afraid to lose. He thought about turning around, about how easy it would be to walk back to his truck and call for help once he hit a stretch of road with signal, leaving these men to wait just a little longer for someone else to find them. But there was no guarantee anyone else would stop. He had just watched 2 vehicles do exactly what he was considering doing now, slowing down long enough to see the danger and speeding up long enough to avoid it. If he left, these 4 men might still be here after dark, when whoever had chained them to these trees decided to finish what they started. He thought of Maya again, not the version of her waiting by the door, but a version of her years from now, old enough to ask her father real questions about the kind of man he had chosen to be. He thought about what he would want a stranger to do if it were her someday, stranded somewhere with no one but the wrong kind of people passing by. The question settled something in him that all the ticking clocks in the world could not undo. He set his backpack down at the base of one of the trees and stepped closer to the men, keeping his voice low and even, the same voice he used with Maya when she woke from nightmares, certain that something terrible was still in the room. He told them not to be afraid, that he was going to help them, and as the words left his mouth he felt the shape of his own life shift slightly, the way a road shifts direction without you ever seeing the turn coming. In that clearing, with the light fading and no phone in his pocket and no idea who had done this or when they might return, Yancey Brooks stopped being only a father racing the clock to get home. He became the one thing standing between 4 strangers and whatever was supposed to happen to them next, and there was no clock, no promise to a 6-year-old waiting by a door, that could make him walk away now that he had already stepped forward. Yancey did not have tools built for something like this. What he carried was a half-empty bottle of water, a grease-stained rag from the garage, and a small multi-tool he kept clipped to his belt out of habit more than plan. None of it was made for chains or industrial padlocks, but none of it mattered as much as simply refusing to stand still while 4 men waited on him to decide what came next. He started with the man whose hand had gone purple, working a thick branch and a flat stone between the chain and his wrist to buy him a little room to breathe. It was slow work, done with hands that kept shaking despite his effort to steady them, every snap of a twig in the surrounding trees, pulling his attention toward the tree line where the fourth man had warned him danger might still be waiting. The man with the gash across his hairline needed more than pressure and patience. Yancey soaked the last of his rag in what remained of his water and pressed it against the wound, holding it there with one hand while he kept working at the chains with the other, splitting his attention between two men who both needed him at once. Neither complained about waiting. Neither had much strength left to complain with. The zip ties binding their hands came apart easily enough once he found them, cut clean with the small blade folded into his multi-tool. The padlocks were a different problem entirely, built solid enough that no branch or stone was going to force them open, and after several minutes of failed attempts, Yancey understood he was not going to free anyone by brute force alone. He left the men chained for a moment, running back toward the motorcycles scattered near the road, checking the saddlebags for anything useful. In the second bike he searched, tucked beneath a folded rain jacket, he found a pair of bolt cutters heavy enough to matter, and a flicker of relief cut through him at the sight of them, as if the forest itself had decided to give him one small piece of help. One by one, the chains fell away from the trees, and one by one, 4 grown men who had spent hours, certain no one was coming, finally stood on their own legs again. None of them said much in that moment. There was only the sound of breathing, of chains hitting the dirt, of a forest that had been holding its silence finally letting it go. Yancey knew freeing them was not the end of what needed to happen. Someone still needed real help, real bandages, a real hospital, and none of that was going to arrive on its own out here where even his own phone had shown nothing but empty bars since he pulled off the road. He told the men to stay together and stay low, then took off running up the incline toward higher ground, chasing the one bar of signal he remembered catching once near the old water tower half a mile up. The call to 911 felt like it took both no time at all and far too long, his voice cutting in and out as he gave the dispatcher what little he knew. The mile marker, the description of the men, the warning that whoever had done this might still be nearby with weapons. When the call ended, he did not wait to see if it had gone through cleanly. He turned and ran back down the incline toward the clearing, lungs burning, legs already exhausted from a day that had started before sunrise and had no intention of ending soon. Back among the trees, the older man who had spoken first was watching him with the same sharp attention as before, though something in his expression had shifted from wariness into something closer to quiet calculation. His eyes moved from Yancey's face down to his wrist, where a small beaded bracelet spelled out a single name in mismatched plastic letters, the kind of gift a child makes at a summer craft table and a father wears until it falls apart on its own. The man asked if the name belonged to his daughter, and Yancey, still working to stop the bleeding along the other man's hairline, answered without looking up, telling him that Maya was waiting for him at home, and that all 4 of these strangers surely had someone waiting on them too. It was not meant as anything more than the truth, but the older man went quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence usually did, as if the words had landed somewhere he had not expected them to reach. Sirens finally cut through the trees, distant at first and then closer, until red and blue light began flickering against the pines beyond the clearing. Paramedics moved fast once they arrived, splitting their attention between the 4 injured men. While 2 officers began asking questions, Yancey answered as briefly as he could manage, his mind already halfway back to a small house on the edge of town, where a 6-year-old girl had been waiting far longer than he had ever let happen before. One of the officers held him a little longer than the others, explaining that the men had likely been targeted by a crew known for robbing riders along isolated stretches like this one, a crew still very much unaccounted for. He asked Yancey to come by the station in the coming days to look through some photographs, since he had gotten a clearer look at the surrounding area than any of the victims currently could. Yancey agreed, though the request settled into his stomach like a stone, a quiet reminder that stopping tonight might not be something that simply ended once he drove away. He gave the officer a neighbor's number instead of his own, since his own house had never once held a reliable signal, and then he asked, as evenly as he could manage, whether the men responsible knew who had found their victims. The officer could not promise him an answer either way, only that it was possible, and Yancey carried that uncertainty with him the entire drive home, checking his mirrors more than usual, glancing twice at every car that lingered too long behind him. Maya was standing in the neighbor's doorway when he finally pulled up, her small shoulders relaxing the moment she saw his headlights turn onto the street. She did not ask why he was late. She simply ran to him the way she always did, and he held her a little longer than usual that night, grateful in a way he could not fully explain to a 6-year-old, that tonight had not been the night his promise finally broke. For the next several days, Yancey moved through his routine with a quiet watchfulness he had not carried before, glancing out the window a little longer each time a car slowed near the house, keeping his phone closer than usual even though it rarely had enough signal to matter. He did make the trip to the station that weekend. Sitting through a stack of photographs, an officer slid across the table one at a time, but nothing in the pile matched what little he had seen of the men who had done this. He left without answers, though the officer promised to call the moment there was anything worth calling about. Nothing happened after that. No strange cars, no threats, no sign that the men who had chained 4 strangers to trees even knew his name. Slowly, the watchfulness eased its grip, though it never fully let go. 2 days after the rescue, a black pickup truck Yancey did not recognize pulled into his driveway, and the man who stepped out was the same older rider from the clearing, cleaned up now, dressed simply, carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that made Ray Dalton's garage feel small by comparison. He introduced himself as Garrett Sullivan, and he did not waste time before holding out a thick envelope, thanking Yancey plainly for what he had done in the forest. Yancey looked at the envelope for a long moment before shaking his head and stepping back from it, explaining that he had not gone into those trees for money and did not intend to start being paid for it now. He told Garrett honestly that he did not want his daughter growing up believing people only do the right thing when there is a reward waiting on the other side of it. Garrett did not push the envelope further, but something behind his eyes shifted, as though he were quietly redrawing the entire plan he had walked in with. Before he left, Garrett glanced past Yancey through the open front door, and in that brief look he took in more than Yancey realized. A kitchen with only a few items on the shelves, a stack of mail with a red stamped notice sitting on top, a small orange bottle of insulin resting carefully in the refrigerator door, a glass jar half filled with loose coins and small bills, a spiral notebook open on the table covered in sketches of bridges and machines, a yellowed acceptance letter still hanging on a bedroom wall visible down the hallway, and taped beside it, a child's crayon drawing of 2 people standing outside a house, with the words "Dad always comes back" written across the bottom in uneven 6-year-old handwriting. Garrett did not say anything about what he saw, but he carried it with him when he left, and it changed the shape of what he intended to do next. He no longer wanted to simply repay Yancey for one night in the forest. He wanted to understand how a man capable of this much sacrifice for strangers had ended up with almost nothing left over for himself. In the days that followed, Garrett quietly gathered what he could learn about Yancey Brooks, discovering a young man who had once ranked near the top of his graduating class, whose acceptance into a demanding engineering program had been set aside the moment fatherhood and loss demanded something else from him instead. He learned that Yancey had never missed one of Maya's medical appointments, had never once asked anyone in town for help, and had built an entire life around the quiet, unglamorous work of simply showing up. Meanwhile, Yancey's situation continued tightening around him in ways that had nothing to do with the forest or the men he had saved. Maya's glucose monitor failed one morning without warning, and the money he had been slowly saving toward a technical course at the community college disappeared instantly into a replacement device instead. A final notice arrived from the landlord days later, the numbers on it larger and more urgent than anything he had faced before. And in the middle of all of it, an offer came through for long-haul driving work that paid nearly double what the garage did. Work that would keep him on the road for weeks at a time, far away from a daughter who had already lost one parent to something she could not control. He did not accept the driving job right away, but he stopped pretending the engineering dream still had a place in his future. The spiral notebook closed. The Georgia Tech letter stayed on the wall, but it stopped feeling like a promise and started feeling like something closer to a scar, proof of a version of himself that circumstances had quietly buried. What Yancey did not know was that Garrett Sullivan understood loss in a way few people could claim to. 18 years earlier, his own son had been left injured on the side of a road much like County Road 12, passed by driver after driver who saw him and kept moving, until the call for help finally came too late to matter. Out of that grief, Garrett had built the Iron Compass Brotherhood around a single, unbending principle, that no one should ever be left behind on a road again. And for 18 years he had wondered whether that principle still meant anything to anyone outside the riders who carried his organization's patch on their jackets. Yancey, stepping into that clearing, had answered a question Garrett had been asking for almost 2 decades, proving that the kind of courage his son never received still existed somewhere out there, waiting for the right moment to show itself. And the fact that it had come from a father, from a man who understood exactly what it cost to risk not coming home, made it mean something even Garrett had not expected to feel again. 2 weeks after the rescue, on a morning that started like every other morning in the Brooks household, Yancey woke to a sound he did not immediately recognize, a low rolling rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rattling the windows and setting the glasses in the kitchen cabinet trembling against each other. Maya came running into his room in her socks, eyes wide with the particular fear of a child who has learned that unexplained sounds sometimes means something has gone wrong. Yancey walked to the front door with Maya close behind him, and when he opened it, the sight in front of him stopped every thought in his head at once. The dirt road leading up to his house was no longer empty. It was filled, edge to edge as far as he could see, with motorcycles and riders standing beside them, headlights stretching down the road like a river of light with no visible end. Engines still rumbling low enough to shake the ground beneath his own front porch. This was not 20 riders, and it was not 200. There were, by every rough count later reported, more than 2,000 of them, arrived from states Yancey had never even visited, standing shoulder to shoulder outside a house that had never in its life seen more than a handful of cars parked along its road at once. And walking toward the porch, ahead of all of them, was Garrett Sullivan, his eyes moving from Yancey to the small girl gripping her father's hand behind him. Garrett stopped at the base of the porch steps, close enough that Yancey could see the same steadiness in his eyes that had been there in the forest weeks earlier, though now it carried something softer beneath it. Behind him, 2,000 engines had gone quiet almost at once, leaving a hush that felt even heavier than the noise before it, as if the entire road was holding its breath, along with the man standing on it. Garrett spoke first, telling Yancey plainly that he remembered the envelope being turned away, and that nothing in his hands today was going to repeat that mistake. He said they had not come to hand Yancey money he would only refuse a second time. They had come, he explained, to make certain that a good father never had to give up his own future simply because he had chosen, on one ordinary afternoon, to save people he had never met. Yancey stood in his doorway with Maya's small hand still wrapped around his, trying to make sense of a scene that felt too large for the life he had built around glucose checks and grease-stained coveralls. He was standing at the edge of losing his home, his time, and the last of his own ambitions, yet some part of him still recoiled at the idea of standing on his own porch and simply accepting whatever this crowd had driven hundreds of miles to offer him. Garrett seemed to understand the hesitation before Yancey could put words to it, and rather than pushing further, he began laying out what the Iron Compass Brotherhood had spent the last 2 weeks building, one piece at a time, each one landing with its own particular weight. The first piece concerned Yancey's own future, the one he had folded away along with his notebook of sketches. Garrett explained that the Sullivan Crane Foundation would cover the full cost of an adult engineering program at Georgia Tech, structured on a schedule built around a working father raising a young daughter alone, with books, transportation, and childcare included, so that nothing about the arrangement would quietly become another burden. He told Yancey that the letter hanging on his bedroom wall had never been proof of a dream that died. It had only ever been proof that Yancey had been ready for this for a very long time, waiting on a life that finally had room for it. The second piece concerned Maya. Garrett said the foundation would cover her insulin, her monitoring equipment, her specialist visits, and an emergency medical fund that would carry her clear through adulthood, so that her father would never again have to choose between her prescriptions and a roof over her head. He crouched down slightly as he said this part, bringing himself level with Maya's height, and told her directly that her father would never have to make that choice again. A sentence simple enough for a 6-year-old to understand completely. The third piece was the house itself, the one Maya had drawn in crayon with the words about her father always coming back. More than 200 of the riders who had come that morning were electricians, roofers, plumbers, and carpenters by trade, and within 48 hours, the house would be repaired from the leaking roof down to the faulty wiring. Yancey had been too proud and too broke to mention to anyone. He was not being handed a new life in an unfamiliar place. He was being helped to keep the only one Maya had ever called home. The fourth piece looked outward, toward the town itself rather than just the house on its edge. An abandoned storefront on Main Street would become something called the Brooks Compass Center, offering free classes in mechanics, welding, and basic electrical work to anyone in Winslow Springs who needed a way forward, with a child care space built in so single parents would not have to choose between learning a trade and caring for their own children. Garrett mentioned, almost as an aside, that Ray Dalton had already agreed to run the program, a detail that struck Yancey harder than almost anything else said that morning. The fifth piece was Yancey's own path forward professionally, a paid apprenticeship with Sullivan Crane Industries, working directly alongside engineers, designing infrastructure for rural communities, much like his own, with hours built around school and around Maya, rather than against them. Yancey listened to all of it without speaking, his hand still resting on his daughter's shoulder, the crowd behind Garrett silent enough that the only sound left was the wind moving through the pines at the edge of the property. When he finally spoke, it was not gratitude that came out first, but something closer to disbelief at his own place in all of this, telling Garrett quietly that he had only done what anyone should have done that day in the forest. Garrett answered that plenty of people had driven past those trees before Yancey ever slowed down, and not one of them had stopped. Only Yancey had. That single fact, repeated now in front of 2,000 witnesses, was the entire reason any of them were standing on this road at all. Yancey admitted quietly enough that only Garrett and Maya could really hear it, that accepting this scared him more than the forest had. He had built his whole life around the idea that no one owed him anything and he owed everyone his best effort in return, and some part of him worried that taking this much help would teach Maya the opposite lesson, that a man could not stand on his own 2 feet without someone else stepping in to hold him up. It was Maya, not her father, who said the thing that finally broke through whatever resistance he had left. She looked up at him with the plain logic only a child fully believes in, reminding him that he had always taught her to say thank you when someone helped her, and asking him, with no understanding of how large the question actually was, why he would not let these people help him now. Something in that question landed differently than anything Garrett had offered. Standing there on his own porch with his daughter's hand in his, Yancey understood that refusing this kind of help was not proof of strength the way he had always told himself it was. It was only another way of teaching Maya that kindness only ever moved in one direction, from him outward, never back toward the two of them. He did not want her growing up believing that. He wanted her to understand that people who give everything are still allowed to receive something in return. He told Garrett, in a voice steadier than he expected, that he accepted, and the reaction that rose up from 2,000 riders at that moment was not cheering exactly, but something quieter and more solid than that. A low wave of engines starting back up almost in unison, as if the whole crowd had been holding that response in reserve until they heard the word yes. Over the following 48 hours, the house Yancey had grown up worrying over transformed piece by piece. Maya stood in the front yard in a hard hat, several sizes too large for her, watching riders carry lumber and wiring through the front door with the same seriousness other children reserve for watching fireworks. Yancey did not stand back and observe the way a homeowner might have. He moved through the work alongside the crew, asking questions about wiring diagrams and structural framing, filling pages of his old spiral notebook with new notes instead of old sketches, treating the whole process as the first lesson in an education he had waited a decade to resume. One moment during those 2 days stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Garrett knelt down in the yard in front of Maya, at her level again, and told her plainly that her father would never have to choose between her medicine and their rent again. The same promise from the porch repeated now, with the work already underway around them as proof it was more than words. Word of what was happening spread through Winslow Springs faster than anyone could have organized it. Neighbors who had never met Yancey beyond a passing wave began showing up with casseroles and extra hands, standing shoulder to shoulder with riders they had never met, patching a roof or clearing brush from the yard. What had started as 2,000 strangers arriving for one family slowly widened into something closer to an entire town remembering what it looked like to rebuild together. That momentum did not stop once the house was finished. The Brooks Compass Center broke ground within weeks, and free trade classes filled faster than anyone expected. With a small child care room next door, that meant a single mother no longer had to choose between learning welding and watching her toddler. Storefronts that had sat empty for years on Main Street slowly began filling again, drawn by the sudden sense that Winslow Springs was a town worth investing in after all. A community health fund started covering costs for families who, like Yancey once had, quietly went without rather than ask for help. Students who had never imagined college as a real possibility found scholarships and rides to campus tours. And along County Road 12 and roads like it throughout the county, small emergency call stations began appearing, solar-powered and simple, built for exactly the kind of moment that had once left 4 men chained to trees with no way to call for help. Not long after, word reached Yancey through the same officer who had shown him the stack of photographs weeks earlier, letting him know that the crew responsible for the attack in the forest had finally been caught 2 counties over, following a similar attempted robbery that had not gone as smoothly for them the second time. The news reached him almost gently, like a door finally closing on a room he had been avoiding looking into, a tension he had not fully admitted to carrying until it was gone. Yancey started his engineering coursework that fall, still waking before sunrise to check Maya's glucose levels, still making breakfast and getting her hair done before school, the rhythm of fatherhood unchanged, even as everything around it shifted. What had changed was not the shape of his mornings, but the fact that he no longer had to sacrifice one part of himself to protect another. He was allowed, for the first time in years, to be a father and an engineer at once, rather than choosing between them. His first project in the program was not abstract or theoretical. It was a solar-powered emergency communication station designed specifically for rural roads without cell coverage, built from the same instinct that had once sent him running uphill through the trees searching for a single bar of signal. The first working unit was installed exactly where that instinct had first been tested, along County Road 12, not far from where 4 strangers had once waited chained to trees for someone willing to stop. 6 months after that morning, when 2,000 motorcycles filled the road outside his house, Garrett returned alone, without the crowd, without the envelope, just a man in his pickup truck pulling into a driveway that finally matched the family living inside it. He and Yancey sat together on the porch while Maya played in the yard nearby, and for the first time, Garrett spoke openly about his son, about the road that had taken him, and about 18 years of wondering whether the principle behind Iron Compass had ever truly mattered to anyone beyond the riders who wore its patch. Yancey answered him simply, telling Garrett that he had spent nearly 2 decades building an organization meant to guarantee no one was ever left behind again, but that on the day it mattered most, it had been Garrett himself who needed proof that someone would actually stop. Maya ran over partway through their conversation, holding out a small wooden compass star she and her father had carved together, with words burned carefully into the back reading, "Thank you for helping my dad come home." Garrett took it without a word at first, then tucked it into his jacket pocket, directly over his heart, before finally speaking again. Before he drove away that evening, Garrett stopped his truck once more at the spot along County Road 12, where 4 men had once been chained to trees, now marked instead by the small solar emergency station Yancey had designed, surrounded by a modest garden someone from town had planted, and a simple wooden sign staked into the ground beside it that read, "Someone once stopped here." The story closes on an ordinary morning, much like the one that started it. Yancey driving Maya to school before continuing on toward his classes at Georgia Tech, The truck moving down familiar roads that no longer felt as isolated as they once had. The remarkable part of everything that followed was never really the 2,000 riders who showed up outside a small house in Georgia. It began earlier than that, in a quiet forest, when one father running late to see his daughter chose to stop anyway for 4 strangers he owed nothing to. And it leaves behind one question for anyone listening to carry with them. When the choice comes down to your own safety or a stranger's desperation, will you be the one who stops or the one who keeps driving past? If this story moved you, that's exactly why this channel exists, to find people like Yancey and share what they did when nobody was watching. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and tell us in the comments, would you have stopped that day too? Either way, thank you for listening. And until next time, take care of the people around you, even the ones you have not met yet.